Hey guys, welcome to Read Aloud for day 30, October 23rd. Alright, here we go. Poor Bilbo. One day, nosy and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under part of the lowest regions of the palace and joined the forest river some way further to the east. Beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened, where this underground watercourse came forth from the hillside, there was a water gate. There the rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from it a porculus, I think that's how you say it, porculus could be dropped right down to the bed of the river to prevent anyone from coming in or out that way. Porculus is like a metal gate that drops down like in a castle. Okay. If anyone had come in that way, he would have found himself in a dark and rough tunnel leading deep into the heart of the hill. But at one point where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the wood elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine, though no vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought forth from far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trap doors and their use, and lurking there listened to the talk of the king's servants. He learned how the wine and other goods came up the rivers, or overland to the long lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built on bridges far into the waters as protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up from the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and poled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded onto flatboats. When the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river where the bank jutted out near the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the long lake. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate and wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends, and at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passages, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in the darkness. And then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight, clearing the cellars of the empty wood. So let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. I'll taste with you and see if this is fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do good to send up poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at a table on which two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy, but this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwinion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not the butler's great flagons. Flagons were like the really big jugs that you drink out of. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head. Then he laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded to the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages towards the cell. The great bunch seemed very heavy in his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink and a clank, which put him all in a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad as he was to get out of his wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions and know what Bilbo was going to do and all about it. No time now, said the Hobbit. Just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape or none, and this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, with chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue. That's a good fellow. There's a picture of I think that's Thorin. Then off he went from door to door until his following had grown to 12, none of them any too nimble with the dark and what with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time one of them bumped into another or grunted or whispered in the dark. Drat this dwarvish racket, he said to himself, but all went well and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far down in a deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. Upon my word, said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends, Gandalf spoke true as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. And I am sure we are all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next? Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea as far as he could, but he did not feel at all sure how the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too, for certain, they muttered. We thought you had some great sensible notion when you managed to get hold of the keys. This is a mad idea. Very well, said Bilbo, very downcast and also rather annoyed. Come along back to your nice cells, and I will lock you all in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get a hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try. That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way into the supper halls, or to fight their way out of the gates that closed by magic. And it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So following the Hobbit down into the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door which the chief guard and the butler could be seen still happily snoring with smiles upon their face. The wine of the Dorwinian brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. That will save him some of the trouble he is in for, said Mr. Baggins to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow and quite decent to prisoners. It will puzzle them all, too. They will think we had a very strong magic to pass through all those locked doors and disappear. Disappear. We have got to get busy very quick if that is to happen. Balin was told to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into the adjoining cellar with the trap doors. There was little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors in the stream. These were in fact already standing in rows in the middle of the floor waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use, as they could not easily be opened at the end without a great deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them there were several others which had been used for bringing other stuff, butter, apples, and all sorts of things to the king's palace. They soon found 13 with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and as they climbed in, the dwarves thought anxiously of the shaking and bumping they would get inside. Though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack them in as cozily as he could be managed in a short time. At last 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin gave a lot of trouble and turned and twisted in his tub and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about the air holes and said he was stifling even before the lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides of his barrels and fix on all sides the lids as safely as could be managed, and now he was left alone again, running round, putting the finishing touches to the packing, and hoping against hope that his plan would come off. It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came the sound of voices and the flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of a song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. That's where we got to stop for the week, and we will pick this up on Monday, day 31. Thanks, guys.